Hi, so my name's Lee P. I am the artistic director of a company called 1UPSTARTs. We're sort of based in Hull. We started off as kind of a theatre company officially. Since then, we've kind of moved into a number of sort of weird, wacky, wonderful projects. So we're kind of more production company than anything else. But yeah, we sort of officially specialise in the creation of interactive performance and sort of in general kind of interaction design, sort of a lot of gameplay mechanics. We kind of come up with exciting ways to integrate those into narrative. So that kind of brings me on to what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today, hopefully. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my company, where that sort of came from, how I kind of approached something that's kind of a little bit video gamesy from a very non-video game perspective. I'm also going to talk about sort of my specific area of expertise. So I know a lot about the creation of sort of non-linear narratives, in particular how you might approach developing sort of a story for a game where people can sort of make those choices throughout. And then hopefully I'm going to do sort of like an overview of some bits of software that you can potentially get involved with for either really, really cheap or completely for free. So hopefully, you guys can start dipping your own feet into sort of the video games industry. So yeah, so I'm going to start off by talking about my company, where that kind of came from, how that sort of came about, just to sort of give you an idea of how sort of weird and wacky your journey into an industry might be, and how out of left field it sometimes can come. So in terms of my background, so academically, I'm very much not from video games whatsoever. I grew up in a very theatrical household. Both my parents worked in the industry. My dad was a composer. My mum was an actress and a writer. And that was kind of, an industry I was kind of born and bred into a little bit. I spent a lot of time as a kid watching plays and films and musicals and all that kind of stuff. And sort of slowly picking up tips and tricks along the way just from that sort of kind of immersion growing up in that. So it makes sense that I eventually went on and continued my studies with that, and I went for a drama degree in particular. Of course, that's not to say that I didn't have any sort of background in video games whatsoever. At a sort of a very young age, I picked up video games from my dad. He had sort of like a Sega Mega Drive. I ended up getting my own Nintendo 64 at quite a young age. And since then, gaming has been a very important corner of my life. I think I've probably not missed out on playing a video game for more than a week in the past maybe 20 years of living, which is... I don't know if that's good or bad. I'll leave that to you to figure out. But gaming in particular always held a certain soft spot in my heart, and it wasn't really until after I finished my drama degree that I realised, sort of looking back on things that I'd experienced, thinking about sort of plays and films and other bits of entertainment that I'd come across, about what it specifically was about video games that kind of was different, I guess, for me, and kind of how I wanted to sort of integrate that into my work in a modern day. So the thing that sort of really threw me back was thinking back to sort of one of the most sort of visceral responses that I had to a video game in the past as a kid. And it was one of the first games that I ever actually played on the Nintendo 64. Specifically, it was a game called Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars, if you're in Europe. And that was a game, for anyone not aware, where you'd play as the captain of a team of space fighter pilot animal things that were basically tasked with dealing with this giant, evil, disembodied monkey head called Andros. And you had to chase him down and stop him from trying to destroy the galaxy or take over, whatever those guys do. The thing that was really interesting about this game in particular, and I'll hopefully have sort of an infographic up on here to sort of support it, was the fact that this was one of the first pieces of non-linear entertainment that I kind of came across. Star Fox is not very overt about this at all. It's kind of, if you're in the know, you know. But on certain levels, there are basically tasks that you need to complete, and if you manage to complete them, you get put onto what's sort of considered the hard path. And if you fail them, then you'll stay on the easy path. And as you can sort of see in the diagram, it shows sort of the series of different levels that you work your way through. Rather than going from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, there's a whole host that you could kind of drift between. And the reason this sort of sticks in my mind in particular wasn't necessarily because you could go between different levels, but it was from a narrative perspective and the way that they sort of approached endings in that game in particular. So if you didn't manage to go all the way down the hard route, if you did okay on most of the levels but you fluffed it on a couple of them, you'd get one particular ending where you think you've caught up with Andros, you're at his base, and you're fighting his giant sort of ugly mug. And then all of a sudden his face explodes and it reveals that there's actually a robot, and he's just left behind a robot twin to buy him time to escape. So you have to beat the twin. You manage to fly out of the base, and the ending's kind of is alright. People are like, yeah, we've done all right, but you got away, so it'll probably be back to cause trouble in the future. It's all right. But the true ending. So if you manage to do all sort of the difficult bits and pieces, all the hard stuff, you manage to catch up with Andros before he puts his robot twin in place. So you same sort of fight again. You fight his face. You blow up a load, and then you have to fight his actual brain. Very scarring for a 7-year-old. I remember that quite clearly. But yeah, the whole point is that you beat his brain. You've beaten the proper boss. Suddenly his base starts exploding around you, and you're guided out of these sort of this series of tunnels by the ghost of your father, who perished fighting the boss all those years ago. And yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't really sell it enough for people in 2021 for a game that's, I think, like 24 years old at this point. I do apologise if I've spoiled that for anyone. But the feeling as a 7-year-old that you get from getting to the end of that, compared to, I guess things like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or like other big forms of entertainment, it's satisfying to watch the end, apart from Game of Thrones. It's satisfying, but it's not quite the same because you're not engaged with it in the same way. The feeling that you get from being a boss or getting the good ending in a game after beating your head against that wall over and over again is just leagues apart from what you get from sort of more fixed linear entertainment. And this was a conclusion that I didn't sort of come back to until I finished my drama degree. So it took a while to sort of really properly sink in. And immediately I kind of went, okay, I've finished my degree about a year or so ago. I've been doing front of house in a theatre. I've been working in little bits of the industry, but nothing's quite satisfying enough. I want to go back and I want to see how I can sort of integrate some of these techniques into the work that I'm doing now. Because I work as a playwright. I've written a number of sort of linear content bits and pieces, but I think the non-linear stuff was always more interesting for me. So I ended up going back to the University of Hull. I asked if I could do Masters of Research in particular. So that was different to an all Masters. Masters are kind of much more led in terms of what you learn from them. Masters of Research, you kind of go there and you go, I want to teach myself about this. Am I okay to look into it? And the university went, you know what, sure, go for it. So then I spent a year specifically looking into non-linear narratives and how to sort of actualize them in live performance. So in order to do this, I kind of obviously looked at quite a few bits of gaming. I sort of learned from how some of those things operated, and I'm going to shift across and talk a little bit about that now. So one of the shows that I can briefly talk about was a show that we did called Passenger Car 425. This was like a dystopian thriller set in sort of a post-apocalyptic wasteland where people were trying to get access to the last safe space in Britain called Project Liberty. The idea of this show was that there were a number of different people that would come in with sort of different morally complex backstories, and then people would be able to vote who they sort of found most forgivable and who they thought deserved safety by using their smartphones in the middle of the show. So this show was kind of us trying to explore the possibility of having a show where characters may or may not survive from one moment to the next, and kind of the many different iterations that would come off of the back of that. So we initially looked at a few sort of BioWare games in particular, Mass Effect and Dragon Age, and the way that they kind of approached having a party system where potentially you might have one character, you might have another. It depends entirely on who you sort of decide to bring with you. The way that those games kind of approached it was the main character would say a thing, it would always be the same fixed thing, and then a party member would respond to it. They would have like a dedicated slot where party member 1 or party member 2 would always respond, and depending what sort of personality that character had, obviously they had their own set response to that.
He said, I should go. Do I sound like that?
As long as I've known you,
Yeah. Yes. Yes, you do.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
On at least 216 known occasions that I have witnessed.
Yeah. Yeah, now that you mention it.
So the narrative would still continue, it would still make sense, but obviously they could still continue forward. So we kind of duplicated that and tried to put it into this live narrative. And the way that I kind of planned that was by utilising flowchart, as you can hopefully see here. So this show broke down into 4 separate vote states. You had 3 1v1s, and then finally for the very last vote, it was between 3 separate people, and only a single person could win. So having 6 people come in on this train and take part in this sort of voting game, we always knew there was going to be 6 different endings. But in terms of the possible iterations that could take on the way, there's a whole host of different possibilities there could be. So by putting it into this flowchart, we could see that there was definitely going to be 24 possible iterations that the show could go. You know, there was always going to be 1 winner out of each of the 3 pairs, and then that final winner from the 3-way vote. So by doing this, we could kind of initially plan if the way that we approached the script was going to be too complicated, or, you know, if we wanted to use the Mass Effect sort of Dragon Age kind of approach, where you again had that modular style of dialogue. So they would sort of just fit into that one slot, and they would respond as and when their turn came up. So that was kind of quite an interesting way of approaching that sort of thing. Flowcharts are used quite a lot in the gaming industry in general. I've got hopefully a couple more examples here. This one for Deus Ex about the many different ways that you can approach opening a door in particular, I think is quite a good one. But yeah, so with flowcharts, you can plan quite a lot of your narratives preemptively. And there's a couple of programs that actually you can then incorporate those flowcharts into to make it quite an interesting sort of interactive project. And I'm just going to go over that briefly now. So say you've got the basics down. You've got an idea for a story in your head. You don't know anything about programming. You don't know any of that, but you've managed to turn your stuff into a flowchart. A program that I'd really sort of recommend for people just getting into it would be Twine. Twine is basically something that's built around the HTML programming language, so that you can basically create a series of hyperlinks to put together your story to make it into like this accessible thing. So I've got a really sort of basic example that I've built in this system here. This is a small story called The Car, and basically what you can do is once you've built a version of it in this interface, you can click play and that will load this up. So in its default state, obviously it's just a black screen with white text and blue links, but you can do a few other bits and pieces with it. I'll show you one of my sort of earlier examples in a moment. But using this, so for example, today is a lovely day, you decide to go for a drive, so you get in the car. You open the door, sit down, try and start the car. You turn your key in the engine, but the car won't start. Looks like you've got to put any petrol in. So you get out of the car, and you get your first sort of choice moment here. You can either go back to bed, or you can look in the boot. Say I wanted to go back to bed. I go back to bed and spend the rest of the day asleep. So that's a really quick game over there. Quite simple. You can decide to play again. Go from the start. So this time we're going to get in the car and do everything, but instead we're going to look in the boot. And in the boot we find a petrol can. So we fill up the car. Now we've got fuel. We get back in the car, and we drive off. And you win. So that's a really very, very basic interactive script that you can go through there. So the way that those individual blocks or passages are developed is literally you just write it in and then you craft the hyperlinks using brackets. But say we wanted to add in an extra option here. Say we don't just want to go back to bed or look in the boot, we want to potentially spontaneously explode. So if you put that in as an option, then what that automatically does is it builds another block here. And you can kind of see how these sort of interact with one another. So any of the blocks that go back to the beginning, they link back to the very, very start. Any of sort of the choice moments, they link into the multitude of different choices that you have available to you there. So it's really quite a simple thing. But if you take the time to sort of learn HTML in particular, there are a very wide and vast number of forums that you can go onto. There's some really good Reddit posts and Discords out there. You can do quite a few bits and pieces. So I'm going to show you another project that I was kind of involved with a while back for something called West Man. So this was quite a fun sort of proof of concept, where what I did was I just put together a bunch of bits of text, and I took some sort of placeholder images and music just to kind of give an example of how these things might operate. So this kind of looks a lot more complex because I've got it in the debug view, but basically here you can see all of these variables that are also measured in this game. So it's not just a basic going from link to link kind of thing. There are also bits of data that it can keep track of. So if we just play through this a little bit, so this is where we meet Mayor Winchester. He is basically the big bad guy of this sort of prologue that we put together. And again, you've got your standard sort of choices that you can choose between. Depending on what you choose, that changes some of the variables. So you increase your intimidation by 1. If we look at intimidation now, yeah, so that's now the number 1. So that's gone up by 1 because it was 0 before. And it means that any sort of further down the line, if there are options that are locked off by intimidation being higher than 0, or it needs to be a certain value, that's something that you can build into this. So yeah, that's, as I say, another very, very basic example of what you can kind of achieve in Twine. I realise this is very, very spaghetti looking. I think a lot of sort of initial first projects are probably going to look something similar to this. But the point is that with a lot of these pieces of software, so RPG Maker, with Twine, another one that I can really recommend that I'll pop on screen now, which is Rempe, you can teach yourself a vast quantity of bits and pieces, and you could build your own game from scratch as long as you're willing to put in the time and effort. And even if you're not an artist, you're not necessarily a programmer, and you're just a writer like what I was when I started out, you can find programs that you can start building things in, using them as a proof of concept, showing them to people, artists that you maybe want to work with, musicians that you want to get on board, and then you can build entire teams around just a small idea that you had in your head. So it really is, sky's the limit. And you very, very much don't necessarily need sort of a degree in video games in order to get started. So take it from a guy that did a drama degree. You can get involved in this stuff quite easily. So yeah, that's kind of just a couple of examples there of some stuff that you can get involved with. So there you go. That's kind of my sort of background in terms of bits and pieces. I'll make the links available in the Discord for anyone that is interested in those pieces of software. As I say, the majority of them are free. A couple cost a little bit, but if you wait for a good Steam sale, you should be laughing. And yeah, I guess all I can say is that I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys hopefully produce in the future. So yeah, thanks for watching. My name's been Lee, and I'll catch you around. Cheers.